So welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this lecture, the Tinbergen lecture. My name is Robert Deur and I'm the president of the Royal Dutch Economic Association, of which you are all a member, except for Ernst perhaps. So welcome also Ernst to you. Ernst Fehr will give the Tinbergen lecture today. And the Tinbergen lecture, as you know, and as most of you have also experienced today, is part of the Dutch Economist Day, a day full of events, sessions, presentations, debates, and I have attended already several of them, and my experience was extremely good. It was very interesting and highly interactive. And this, Dutch Economist Day is now sort of halfway. I mean, we also have still afternoon sessions after this lecture, and of course the drinks. But I think it's already safe to say that the day has become a great success. And responsible for that success is a committee, and it is a great committee, great in multiple ways, both in quality but also in quantity. As the Dutch Economist Day has become bigger, also the committee has grown. And I would like to invite all of them to come forward, because we have a little present for you. So let me mention also the names. So it's Kei-Chan Chang and Floris Swets from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy. Guus Brouwer, Ria den Hollander and Karin van der Kruijsen from the Dutch Central Bank. Nicoletta Churila from CPB, Netherlands Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis, and that's also the institute that was so kind to host most of the sessions this morning. Thanks a lot. Tim van der Valk and Gentle Stutterheim from the Ministry of Finance. Asra Zelinovic from the Ministry of Social Affairs and Employment. Yeah, I told you it's a great committee now. We're halfway now. No, I'm joking. So, Emiel Evenhuis from PBL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. Max van Lent, Department of Economics at Leiden University, and that is also the department and the university that is hosting us this afternoon. Thank you very much. Irla van de Ven from the Dutch Economics Platform ASB. And finally, last but not least, the chairperson of the committee, Annemiek Verrips from CPB, Netherlands Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis. Yeah, so I wanted to say that, you know, the success of this day can be fully attributed to you, and by that I mean it literally, because you have been responsible for the contents of the program, for the ideas, what topics. I thought the topics were super well chosen, but also all practical matters, which is of course also not so easy, in particular if the interest in the day is so big that, you know, you need to, in the last minute, find all kind of rooms and other locations and stuff. And so a big thank you once more. So I would like to personally hand out the flowers to you all, but it would take too much time. So may I ask you to take your own flowers? But to Annemiek, I give it personally, okay? So. Please, another big round of applause for the committee. Oh, that can ook. Yeah, you can also leave them here if you like that better. Whatever you prefer. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, so before we turn to the Tinbergen lecture, I'd like to bring up two more issues. So the first concerns conduct, and in particular misconduct in the economics profession. Because as you may have heard in the news, and in particular on social media, the economics profession is experiencing Me Too. Some well-known economists from the US and from Germany have in the past few weeks been accused of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct. Now, these cases are currently being investigated by the employers of these economists, and we greatly welcome these investigations. The Royal Dutch Economic Association clearly condemns all forms of sexual misconduct, discrimination, and non-inclusivity. Sadly, experiences of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct are not at all rare in economics. A few years ago, in 2017, we have experienced another Me Too affair in the profession, and this led, among others, to a survey that was held by our American sister organization, the AEA. And this survey showed that at that time, more than 1 out of 5 women in economics had experienced some form of sexual harassment in a work-related context in the past 10 years. Clearly, we must do better. In the wake of the Me Too affair in 2017, professional organizations such as the AEA and also the MBER have set up codes of conduct and have also appointed ombudspersons. And also the Royal Dutch Economic Association has done so. The codes of conduct at events of the KVS, they can be found on our website. And our ombudsperson is Annemiek Verrips, who you just met. Or, well, you already met her before, but you saw her on stage. So Annemiek Verrips is the ombudsperson, and to her you can also address any violations of the code of conduct at KVS events, such as the event of today. But in this matter, and we find it really important as a board to stress this, it is not only about the codes of conduct that are on paper. These are just a starting point. So we stand for a safe and inclusive professional environment in the world of economics, regardless of sex or race, religion, or whatever type of person that you are. And the Royal Dutch Economic Association will follow the developments in Germany and in the US. And we will also in due course get in touch with these sister organizations to learn about how to do better, because what exactly a professional organization like the Royal Dutch Economic Association can do in these matters is also not yet completely clear. But we have our eyes wide open, and we will make sure to get in touch to learn from the lessons in those other countries. And obviously, of course, we are also welcoming any ideas that you may have on how to, create a better and safer environment in economics, and in particular in our association. And we encourage you to share them either with Annemiek or with me or with any other board member of the Royal Dutch Economic Association. Then, the second issue, on a positive note. It's about ASB, our journal. So ASB has a very rich history. It exists for more than 100 years. So it's not as old as our association, but it's close. And in this rich history, from time to time, big changes happen. And recently, one such a big change has happened. So ASB is no longer restricted access paywalled journal. No, it has become fully open access, free for all platform. Now, and clearly this is a major step. It has been a step on which many people have worked very hard. It wasn't easy to accomplish. It was also not clear at all stages whether it would actually happen one day, but it has been achieved, and it has been met with a lot of enthusiastic responses from many different places in society, not just from people in our association or students, but also, for instance, high school teachers have shown a lot of enthusiasm for ASB to go open access, because many high school students actually want to read articles in ASB when they, for instance, work on their profiel werkstuk. And so now it's much more easy for them also to get to know, the interesting knowledge and insights that are presented by, well, many of us economists. And so we would like to thank all the sponsoring institutions that have made this open access happen. So the universities, ministries, the advisory agencies, Dutch Central Bank, trade unions, banks, and many other institutions that helped in that respect. But in particular, we would also like to thank the people that were involved in this. And I would like to single out one person in particular, and that is Jasper Lucchese. Jasper Lucchese is the editor-in-chief of ASB. And without him, this move would not have happened. So please, a big applause for him. Okay, the Tinbergen Lecture. So the Tinbergen Lecture this year is given by Ernst Fehr. And Ernst Fehr is a professor of economics at the University of Zurich. So Ernst was born in Austria, and he also studied in Austria. He studied at the University of Vienna. He did his undergrad there. He also wrote his dissertation there. And I think it's fair to say, and everybody agrees, that Ernst Fehr, he is a giant in modern economics. His work centers on the issue of what are the key drivers of economic behavior. Now, traditionally, economists have often assumed that people and firms act out of self-interest. We all know those models from Micro 1. And exciting results have followed from that approach. So one thing that I particularly like to teach when I teach Micro 1 is that you can have a situation, there are conditions for it, but you can have a situation where everybody is just self-interested, and yet, you get a really good outcome from a social welfare perspective. I mean, it's almost magic, that this happens, right? Super counterintuitive. Yet, as we all know from introspection and also experience, it's not the case that most people or all people are just self-interested. And many people have pro-social preferences. They are willing to help others. There are also some people who actually are antisocial. They enjoy hurting others. We discussed this morning, right? It's a small group, but we better be careful. Those people also exist. We all know what envy is. No? I mean, we have all experienced it. And we also, from time to time, feel the need to reciprocate. Now, that is the area where Ernst Fehr has made huge advances. So he has made advances in the understanding of these social preferences. He has studied how these social preferences look like, because once you bring up the issue, like maybe people are pro-social, you have many different variants on exactly the way people are pro-social. He has studied how this differs across people, across nations. He will also talk about that today, where it originates from, and maybe most importantly, how it affects equilibrium outcomes in organizations and in markets. Because also here, some surprising, counterintuitive results show up. So you can have situations where everybody, or many, or almost all, is really pro-social and cares a lot about fairness, and yet super unfair outcomes result. So also in this context of pro-social people, you need institutions. You need the right institutions to get good results, though the institutions are sometimes different if you depart from the standard assumption of self-interest. Now, Ernst Fehr has worked on this topic, but actually on many other topics. It's way too much to mention. He has had a big influence on economics in the past decades, but he has also a lot of impact on other fields. I think he is one of the few economists that really crosses disciplinary boundaries, and not only with the social sciences that are close to us, like psychology and sociology, but also with other fields like neuroscience and evolutionary human sciences. Now, and as a result, he has many publications in the best journals in economics, but he has also published very regularly in journals like Nature and Science. And finally, let me also mention that he has really an astonishing number of citations. I know that citations are not a perfect metric, but in Ernst Fehr's case, I looked it up, and it's 9,000 per year. And to put it into perspective, it means that if we only count weekdays, that like every day, so 30 or so articles appear which build on his work. So I mean, this is like a huge influence on economics and other sciences that is clear from these numbers, and we are super delighted to have you here today. So Ernst, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for these nice words. I'm really honored to be able to give the Tinbergen lecture today, and I have chosen as a topic the human quest for fairness and equality. And when Robert invited me, or a few days ago, he sent me an email and said, it would be nice if you could relate what you're doing to Tinbergen somehow. And because this is the Tinbergen lecture, and I have to confess that I didn't know much more than that he won the Nobel Prize before that, but then I looked into the literature, and I discovered that he's best known for his work, and that I knew, of course, that introduces rigorous mathematical and statistical concepts into macroeconomics. He's less well known for his view that the measurement of utility can be a serious scientific endeavor. And he wrote a paper in 1930 called Mathematical Psychology. That's a very nice title. You know, he was prone to formal sciences, to mathematics, and it was not translated into English until a year ago. And so I could read it because I can't read Dutch, but I can read English. And what I discovered was quite amazing. Tinbergen was convinced that it is necessary and possible to measure utility. Necessary in order to predict behavior and answer important questions of justice and morality. Possible, it is possible through experimental methods that enable researchers to measure individuals' indifference curves, Microeconomics 101, individuals' indifference curves in the space of the relevant goods. He didn't call it indifference curves, he used the same term that Pareto used, that was the term ophelimmity curves. Ophelimmity means something like economic satisfaction. Now let me quote a little bit from his 1930 mathematical psychology paper. He writes, "The great advantage of these curves is that they can be experimentally determined and are devoid of any metaphysics." So it's a real scientific endeavor, it's not metaphysics. And then he goes on to say, "I would now like to indicate a few directions in which, to my mind, expansion of the mathematical psychological approach could be of interest. In the first place," and he mentions that first, "it is clear that there is much room for experimental research." And here my heart jumps, of course, because I do a lot of experimental research without knowing, being in the tradition of Tinbergen to some extent. Then he goes on to say, "It is very interesting to ask whether the ophelimmity curves differ greatly between persons, and to what extent these curves are due to characteristics that can be easily identified, like illness or the profession. Here lies an area of psychology which, if I am well informed, is still open to considerable expansion." And finally, he mentions, "In addition, the mathematical psychological method seems to be useful for the analysis of the common conception of justice with regard to the rules governing the distribution of economic goods." Now, what's interesting is when he retired, he devoted the remaining active time of his life to study exactly these questions. And whereas the economists took up his mathematical and statistical concepts that he introduced into macroeconomics, they didn't take up this work because I believe he was far ahead of his time. Now, what will I do today? I will argue and shortly describe to you that our species, Homo sapiens, has deep egalitarian evolutionary roots. Some people may know this. I guess most people don't know this, at least in economics. Many people in anthropology do, and I only know it because I had a lot of contact with them. Second, I will show that we can still find strong traces of these egalitarian roots in contemporary small-scale societies. These are societies of hunter-gatherers, horticulturalists, pastoralists. Third, I will follow Tinbergen's suggestion of measuring preferences with the experimental method. In my case, preferences over the distribution of money, resources between individuals. I measure in particular distributional preferences in broad population samples, so we extend beyond student samples. Fourth, I will study the role of distributional preferences in individual support for political redistribution. Because when we experimentally determine the so-called of-limity curves or indifference curves, we want to know how relevant are they for the behavior outside the laboratory where we have measured them. And finally, I will ask how the characteristics of the population's distributional preferences shape how people respond to credible and truthful information about the actual income distribution. Now, what is well known is that people have very wrong beliefs about the actual income distribution. For example, in Switzerland, if I ask people, what's the share of income that the richest 1% earns in a year, they come up with crazy numbers. I mean, 50, 60%, 40%. In fact, it's 12%. It's, so to speak, surprisingly in some sense low, despite the fact that there is still a lot of inequality. And the question is, how does information, credible information, about the income distribution, how does that shape people's preferences for redistribution? And in particular, who responds to that information? Is it the selfish people? Is it the altruistic people? Or is it what we call the inequality-averse people? But now let me go into the substance of my talk. And I start with the egalitarian roots of Homo sapiens. Now, for roughly 90% of human history, until about 11 to 12,000 years ago, modern humans lived in hunter-gatherer societies. And there is very rich anthropological evidence that shows that a considerable share of the calories were provided by cooperative hunting of big game and egalitarian sharing of food, even with the sick and the injured. These societies were extremely egalitarian in terms of sharing the most valuable foods, which was meat, and in terms of political organization. These hunter-gatherer societies, they lacked powerful chiefs and had a rich menu of leveling mechanisms against strong men or would-be alpha males. And the way they leveled them down, so to speak, was individual and collective criticism. They were ridiculed, they were ostracized, they were expelled from the groups, and sometimes even killed if they didn't restrain themselves. So that raises the question. Now, this was until 11 to 12,000 years ago, okay? And actually, the last 10,000 years is a very small amount of time compared to what Homo sapiens lived for hundreds of thousands of years before that time, okay? So the question then is, can we still observe traces of this egalitarian ethos in contemporary small-scale societies? These are societies of perhaps a few dozen people, sometimes a few hundred maximally. They live in Tanzania, they live in Papua New Guinea, they may live in the Peruvian jungle, and so on. And what we did in the early 2000s, we teamed up with anthropologists, and we conducted experiments that measure this egalitarian ethos. And one famous game that has been used to measure this was the so-called ultimatum game. It's a paradigmatic, simple bargaining game that goes as follows. I and you, we are given provisionally some resource, let's say an amount of money, and then you can make a proposal how to share it. And you can make exactly one proposal. And you typically make this proposal without knowing who is on the other side. We do this under anonymous conditions to rule out all kinds of confounds. And then I can say yes or no, and if I say yes, it's implemented, and if I say no, we both get nothing. So the money, the business opportunity, so to speak, is lost. Okay? So what is the prediction under the self-interest hypothesis in this simple game? Exactly one proposal and one yes or no can be given. Well, if we are both selfish, then you will anticipate that I will accept the smallest amount of the resource. Let's say a cent or $1. You know, I say yes to this because $1 is better than nothing. And that means, and I will accept. So the prediction is very simple. You take almost all the resource, give me just a tiny bit, and I say yes to this. So this is what's called in game theory the subgame perfect prediction, but it's intuitively clear and very simple to understand. Now, when we play this game in 15 of these small-scale societies, then we observe the following. In none of these 15 societies does this equilibrium prediction hold. Basically, in every society, a considerable positive share is offered to the recipients, and in every society, we see rejections of low offers, indicating that people don't accept these low offers, contrary to what the self-interest hypothesis tells us. So this was the first broad cross-cultural evidence that we collected together with anthropologists. But this didn't stop, so we went on and others went on, and in particular, people like Joe Henrich, who is now at Harvard University, or Abigail Barr, who is in Nottingham, they jointly conducted another game that's called a third-party punishment game. And that game is perhaps even more interesting to some extent. Why? Well, it's a game among 3 players. There is a proposer, a passive receiver, and an impartial third party. Again, they remain anonymous to each other, and the game is played one shot. So there's no reputational issues here. There's no repeated game issues. It's just once played once. And it's real money that is at stake. It's real money that is at stake, a real resource. The proposer and the receiver are jointly endowed with a sum of money, but the proposer can unilaterally determine how the money is divided up among the 2 players. He can give 10% to the passive receiver, or 20, or 30, or 40, or 100 in this discrete way. Now, the impartial third party observes what has been done by the proposer, and actually the impartial third party makes a response before the party knows what the proposer did. The impartial third party has also a resource given, but it can use this resource partially to punish the proposer. So, in particular, the impartial third party can sacrifice 20% of her endowment to reduce player 1's, the proposer's income, by 30%. But why should the third party ever do this? And a selfish third party would never do this. A selfish third party would just collect the money and go home and be happy. But if the impartial third party has a notion of morality, has a notion of fairness in his or her mind, then the impartial third party might punish unfair transfers between the proposer and the passive receiver. So that's the idea here, okay, in the third-party punishment game. Okay, so what do we observe here? This game has been played again in 15 different societies. These are, again, small-scale societies, and I'll show you now the data, because they are really impressive for each of these societies. And I show you first the hunter-gatherer society. This is the Hadza in Tanzania. And what you see here on the horizontal axis and on the left vertical axis is the offer frequency. These are the black bars. And so you see all the black bars are between 0 and 50%. So here nobody gives more than 50%. So you see self-interest kicks in. Some people, some first movers or proposers give 0, some give 50%. Now of particular interest is this line with the triangles. Because the line with the triangles, this is shown on the right axis, tells you the degree of non-punishment. So when this line here goes up to 1, then that means nobody is punished. When it would be to 0, then everybody is punished. And what you see is as soon as the proposers give less than 50%, punishment kicks in. Okay? And it gets stronger and stronger. Now you might say that is among the Hadza in Tanzania. What about the others? Well, look at this. It's very much the same. Look at the other tribes here. It's very much the same. Look at the other 4 tribes. It's very much the same. So basically what we see is typically offers between 0 and 50%, but punishment kicks in when equality is violated. And this is true typically in all societies, across the board. And these are culturally very, very diverse societies. That is important to keep in mind. So how do Swiss students in the role of third parties sanction? Well, they do it similarly. So what you see here is when the dictators or the proposers' transfer falls below 50%, then punishment kicks in, And the black triangle line shows you that roughly 2/3 of the third parties punish. And what's also interesting is that this punishment is expected. It's not just that the third parties punish, but that the passive receivers also expect them to be punished. So this seems to be a very widespread view in society. Okay, so let me summarize these facts. We see that in all societies, selfish deviations from equal sharing are the key trigger for individuals' willingness to sanction. So in all societies, the egalitarian distribution norm appears to play a key role. There is some heterogeneity in the strength of punishment across societies, and within all societies, individuals' willingness to sanction selfish deviations from equality is also heterogeneous. Not all people in a society punish selfish deviations, but those who do, they start punishing typically when selfish deviations from the equality norm occurs, indicating the existence of what could be called an egalitarian ethos. Okay, now these are students, these are small-scale societies. What about our societies? What about the Dutch society? What about the Swiss society or the Danish society? I don't have data on the Netherlands, but I think you are not different from what we find in Denmark or in Switzerland. Anyway, so how do we measure them? What are the fundamental properties of these distributional preferences? Well, as an economist, I look at the so-called indifference curves. I look for theory. What is the guiding theory here? Well, if you look at the space of own payoff and other payoff in a bilateral distribution problem, then the green indifference curve, the vertical curve, is the indifference curve of a selfish individual. Why? Because this selfish individual is never willing to make any trade-offs. This selfish individual gets better off the more own payoff it gets, and it's never willing to sacrifice money for the sake of giving the other guy something. Now, this is an envious individual. What does this individual do? Well, this individual shows a willingness to sacrifice own income, to reduce the other person's income. Okay? So therefore, the indifference curve is positively sloped. Now, here you see the indifference curve of an altruistic individual. Now, what does this indifference curve tell us? Well, this altruistic individual is willing to sacrifice own payoff for the sake of giving payoff to the other individual. Okay? And this individual is willing to do this regardless of whether it is better off, this is below the 45-degree line, or worse off, this is above the 45-degree line. And then you have an inequality-averse individual, which is altruistic in the domain of advantageous payoffs, when it has more own payoff than other payoff, but the individual is envious in the domain of disadvantageous payoffs. It's a strange combination. It's a combination of altruism and envy. Okay? And you might say, well, these people don't exist because an altruist is after all an altruist, and a spiteful and envious guy is after all a spiteful and envious guy. How could they be both simultaneously? Okay? But let's see, we can find out whether they exist. And how do we find out? Well, we give people so-called budget lines. This is their own payoff, this is the other's payoff, and then they have these 7 opportunities here. They can choose this allocation or this allocation. And what you see in this negatively sloped budget line is that tells us whether they are willing to sacrifice own payoff to increase the payoff of the other individual. Okay? Altruism. We can measure altruism here. Okay? But we give them also positively sloped budget lines. And positively sloped budget lines tell us whether this individual is willing, so these are again 7 points on this budget line, and if the individual is willing to reduce his or her own payoff to reduce the other person's payoff, then that individual displays a degree of envy. Okay? And what we do is we confront the individuals with many different budget lines. They have many different slopes. And that allows us to really, in a fine-tuned way, basically experimentally pin down. This is Tinbergen's approach. This is Tinbergen's program. We can identify the indifference curve. And what we can in particular do is we can, in a very fine-graded way, discover whether people are really selfish. Because when you see selfish behavior in a particular situation, that doesn't mean that this person is selfish. It just means that in that situation, the individual behaved selfishly. This individual might well behave altruistically when the costs of the altruistic act are lower. And therefore, you have to vary the costs of the altruistic act in a systematic way. And you have to vary the cost of the envious act in a systematic way to really find out whether people are truly selfish or whether they have some degree of envy or some degree of altruism. And in this way, you can much better find out what the prevalence of selfishness, altruism, and envy is in the population. Okay, so now, before I show you the data, I have to explain you how I present the data, okay? Because these individuals make many choices, and I will represent their choices in the following graphs with a median choice. I could also do the modal choice, and you have to understand how I do this to really follow me. And the way we do this is, look at this negatively sloped budget line. Oops, this was too quick. Look at this negatively sloped budget line. What you see here is what they can choose along this budget line. And we say if the individual is selfish, we give that the number 6. It maximizes, the individual maximizes their own income. If the individual goes for equality to the 45-degree line, we give the number 3. And if the individual minimizes their own income, we give the number 0. Very simple coding, okay? And the same for a positively sloped budget line. 0 means minimizing own income, 6 means maximizing own income, 3 means equality, okay? And now I represent each individual by a dot in the following, but before I do this, I show you what could happen here, for example. Assume, for example, this is the median choice of individuals along the positively sloped budget lines. We have a plus here. This is the median choice along the negatively sloped budget lines. So, for example, if the individual goes always to 6, that means selfish, always selfish, okay? If the individual goes to a very low number on the positively sloped budget lines, that is a very spiteful behavior because it goes down. It reduces the other's income at his or her own costs. So this means spitefulness. Being here means spitefulness. Being here means selfish. Being in the middle means inequality averse. This is an egalitarian altruist here. Why? Because this individual, or the individuals in this ball, so to speak, they go for 3, they go for equality along the negatively sloped budget lines, but they go for self-interest along the positively sloped budget lines. But on the positively sloped budget lines, going for self-interest means also maximizing the other guy's individual. Okay? So this is just that you see what is the possible space of types we could get here. And now let me, and then when you move up here, it's weaker altruism. When you move down here, it's stronger altruism. Okay, so what do we find here? We have 4 different broad population data sets from Switzerland here. And we just descriptively, I described the data to you. We also applied a rigorous clustering technique or classification technique. But when you see the data, you know already what happens. So it's always best when you see it with your naked eye, and you will see everything with your naked eye here. So what we find here is this here. We find 3 clusters of types. We find the inequality averse, we find the altruists, and we find the selfish, and then there are a few others scattered around. Next data set, the inequality averse, the altruistic, and the selfish. Next data set. Same. Next data set. The same. So regardless of which data set we draw, we find these 3 predominant types. Okay? That's quite remarkable. Now you might say, well, the Swiss are this little mountainous population. They are somehow special. They don't talk to each other too much, maybe, because of the mountains. We would do it differently here because we have all these channels where we can do ice skating in the winter. And anyway, so let's look at the Danes, okay? Because we have a very large sample of Danish people. And what we find, and among these 3,600 people, the same. This is quite remarkable. So also in the Danish sample, we find this clustering into these three types, basically. And what's interesting here is that what's the relative proportion here? Well, in Switzerland, the relative proportion is the majority, 40 to 50%, is inequality averse. 30 to 40% is altruistic, and the minority is selfish in Switzerland. In Denmark, it's more 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But what's very interesting here is the selfish are always in the minority relative to the others. And that is quite remarkable, because our paradigm, and still the way we teach in Microeconomics 101, is we assume that everybody is self-interested typically, but we're totally wrong. We're totally wrong. The majority is not self-interested. And the reason why I can say this is that I have a much sharper scissor than everybody's intuition, you know. The sharp scissor I have is I vary the cost in a fine-graded way and can really discover whether people are selfish or not. And if you think about it a minute, you agree immediately that this is not so surprising. Actually, it's anyway only surprising for economists. Because when you tell this story to non-economists, they say, so what? But imagine you are at the train station of Den Haag and a stranger comes to you and asks you, can you tell me where I can go to University of Leiden? And let's say you know. You give the stranger a minute to explain. You sacrifice a minute of your time. Typically, we do. Now, that's not a big altruistic act, but it's an altruistic act, you know. So if you get small enough with your cost, most people are not totally selfish, you know. And that's just what I find here. And now you might say, well, but all the decisions in real life, they are really high stakes. This is not true. 90% of your decisions are low-stake decisions. How often do you buy something for more than 1,000 euros? And how often do you buy something for less than 50 euros? I mean, the frequency, it's totally clear. Most of your actions are low-stake actions and not high-stake actions. Helping a friend at the workplace, helping your colleague, reading the introduction of a colleague's paper to improve it, and so on. Okay. Anyway, so now let me summarize the characteristics of the three types. We can summarize them neatly, qualitatively with these indifference curves. We find a minority of predominantly selfish types. By the way, this line is not always totally vertical. It's kind of slightly tilted into the positive. So there's a degree. Most of the time they mingle up with a little bit of envy. Okay, and then we have the altruistic types, and then we have the inequality-averse types. Now, there is another fundamental characteristic that we find in the data that is really surprising. And it's surprising in view of the fact, so for example, when I talk to my libertarian friends in Switzerland, and they are complaining about all these egalitarian initiatives in Swiss politics, and then they typically say, oh, these guys are just envious. They're just envious. It's just pure envy. You can feel the contempt, you know. And now, what we find is quite interesting in this regard, because what we find is that we find a correlation, a very interesting correlation. And the correlation goes as follows. The more people are generous in the advantageous domain, the more they are selfish in the disadvantageous domain. Why is that the case? Why is a flatter indifference curve implying more generosity? Well, it means that I'm willing to give up more to increase the other guy's payoff by a little. That means more generosity. Flatter in this domain means more generosity. Now, steeper in this domain means more selfish. Why? Steeper means more selfish because I'm willing to give up a dollar only if that dollar creates a lot of other payoff. Okay, so it has to create a lot of benefit for the other guy. Only then I'm willing to do it. And actually, what we find is the more people are generous here, the more they are selfish here. Quite counterintuitive, okay? Now, when we look at the inequality-averse types, then flatter means more generous, and steeper means more envious. The more altruistic they are in the advantageous domain, the more envious they are in the disadvantageous domain. So they're also more altruistic. The people who go for equality, they're not just envious, they're also more altruistic. So it's more complicated. It's more complicated. And I thought this is interesting to communicate this to you. Now, let me go to the next point then. I have shown you how we measure these preferences, what the properties of these preferences are. And now the next step is, why is it important to know this? Well, there are two reasons. One is a normative reason, namely, how should we design our institutions, including the tax transfer system, such that we respect individuals' preferences. And when respecting individuals' preferences also means respecting their altruism and respecting their inequality aversion, not just respecting their selfishness. And for positive reasons, it helps us to better understand how markets, organizations, and political behavior, what are the drivers behind the behaviors in these institutions. Now let me first go to this normative issue. Modern welfare economics, it was in high regard in the 1970s. It is in less high regard these days, it seems to me, but still, it's thoroughly utilitarian, and what we typically maximize is a planner's welfare function, which consists of the sum of individuals' selfish consumption utilities. But this is a caricature. People are not like that. People's preferences are interdependent, and therefore our optimal taxation, our derivations for optimal tax formula should take that into account. It's just as simple as that. We are deeply rooted in the liberal tradition. That means we respect individuals' preferences. So let's also respect individuals' preferences when we compute optimal tax formula. Okay, and there is, by the way, recent work by people like Aronson and Johansen Stenman who do this. Now, the other thing is for positive reasons. So, because it helps us better understand what people want to achieve, what people's goals are. And we studied therefore the determinants of support for 4 strongly redistributive policy measures that were up for voting in a referendum in Switzerland. You may all know we have direct democracy in Switzerland, and what we had over the last 10 to 12 years, we had at least 5 pretty radical left-wing referenda that if they would have been implemented, they would have brought about a lot of redistribution. Actually, one of these referenda was basically just introducing, I always call it, this is hardcore socialism through the back door, and it goes as follows. This was a referendum that would have prohibited any payment in a company where somebody in a company earns more than 12 times the income of the lowest paid individual. Now, if you look at what the current differences are, they're more like 1 to 100, 1 to 200, and going to 1 to 12 would really have been a revolution, basically, you know. And actually, the interesting thing is when I listen to people sometimes, I was on vacation in the southern Switzerland, and I listened to some fairly conservative crowd there, and this was just about the time when one of the big bosses of not Nestle, of Novartis, one of these big pharmaceutical companies, got a payment of something like 70 million just for the purpose of not working for a competitor after he left the company. And people were really outraged by this payment of 72 million. And I listened to them and they were saying, well, actually the proposal 1 to 12 came from the Young Socialists. And then the people, these were surely conservative voters, they said, 1 to 12 is too radical. If it were 1 to 20, I would go for it. I'm not sure whether they really would have gone for it, but it just shows the sentiment in which they were at the time. Anyway, so we study some of these referenda, and this gives us a big advantage because we can kind of validate people's responses in the survey with what people on average did in the different regions. And that's what we do here. We validate our support measure. What you see here is, you see the vote share in the actual referenda. You see here the support measure we collect in our survey, and it's very nicely positively correlated. We have other validation measures. And then what we do is controlling for a host of covariates. We want to ask the question, so we measure also people's social preferences. We know who is inequality averse, we know who is altruistic, we know who is predominantly selfish. And now, in order to tell you what theory predicts, let me shortly introduce you these political economy models. Those who work in political economy, they have heard of the Meltzer-Richards model. It's just a model of proportional tax redistributed lump sum in a budget-balanced way. Okay? And the question is, what is the preferred tax of the individuals? More taxation, a higher tax rate, a higher proportional tax rate means more redistribution because it's redistributed lump sum. And when we do this theoretical exercise, this is the prediction. We see that as a function of the individual's gross income, if they are selfish, their support for taxation declines with their gross income, not surprisingly. Who wants to pay when selfish for the poor? Now, when you are altruistic, this is the green dotted line. It's moderated, so you become more supportive of taxation, in particular at higher income levels. And when you are inequality averse, then you are even more supportive. So we get a hierarchy. The inequality averse, they are most in favor of this taxation, more than the altruistic, and more than the altruistic, more than the selfish. Now let me look at the data. So we have data to look at this, and what we find is this nice figure. What you see here is the selfish, like the theory predicts, a strong decline in support for redistribution the higher your earnings. But when you are inequality averse, this is the blue line, then this is almost flat, not totally flat, but very flat. So basically, the inequality averse, they are very much in favor of redistribution compared to the selfish, in particular when they are affluent. So it's in particular the affluent. So it's this kind of, if you like, affluent left wings, so to speak, you know, who are in favor of redistribution. That's what the theory predicts, and that's what we find in the data. Now, the next question then is, well, this is again Switzerland. Do we find something similar in Denmark? Well, in Denmark, we have the advantage of having very big data sets. We have about 9,000 people there, and we have measured all their preferences. And we have administrative records on their charitable contributions, and we also know their support for redistribution. And now, the Danish prediction is a bit more in a different way sophisticated, because what we do there is we measure the slope of the indifference curve in the advantageous domain and in the disadvantageous domain. Okay, so we know both these parameters in a structurally estimated model, and the prediction is the more inequality averse you are, the more generous you are in the advantageous domain. What's the prediction with regard to charitable donations? Well, the more generous you are in the advantageous domain, the more you give to charity. The more generous you are in the advantageous domain, the more you are for redistribution also. Okay? Now, when you go to the disadvantageous domain, that's where the envy part kicks in for the inequality averse. The prediction is somewhat different. The more envious you are, the less you give to charity, because you are, after all, envious in that part. So the more envious you are in that part. And notice, I can be generous in one part and envious in the other part, and what we do is keeping altruism constant in the advantageous part, varying envy in the other part, does that have ceteris paribus an impact? That's what we can answer, okay? And the prediction is, the more altruistic I am in one part, the more I am for charitable donations, the more I am for redistribution. It's both times positive. But on the envy part, the more envious I am, the less I give to charities, but the more I want to redistribute. And that's exactly what we find for Denmark. That's exactly what we find for Denmark. And to speed up a little bit, I don't have to go over this. And we can do this in the discussion if you like. And this brings me to the final part of my talk, which is, can we learn something about how people respond to information about inequality in the society with their support for redistribution? And I've told you already at the beginning that there are huge misconceptions here. There are huge misconceptions. And there was a referendum in 2021 in Switzerland, which was called the 99% Initiative. It was again initiated by the Young Socialists. And the 99% Initiative wanted to implement the following law. Above an income / wealth threshold, income from wealth should be taxed at a 50% higher rate than labor income. That was the proposal. And since wealth is very unequally distributed, this would have meant more taxation of higher income people. Okay? And this was the initiative. There is a vote. There was a vote on this initiative, and before the vote took place, we collected our data. And we collected our data in two different treatment conditions. In one treatment, first of all, we measured people's beliefs about the prevailing income distribution. And what we find is hugely exaggerated beliefs about the prevailing inequality. Then in the control group, we don't correct that view. And in the treatment group, we give them credible information about the true degree of inequality. So what's the share of income that goes to the top 1% in the population? That's what we told them. And in Switzerland, people do believe statistical offices still. This might not be the same in the US or in other countries, but in Switzerland they do believe, and we can verify that we could correct their beliefs. So we have now a nice controlled experiment. I have a group that still have strong exaggerated beliefs about inequality, and I have another group that has the correct beliefs. And then we hypothesized, this was pre-registered, the hypothesis, because it's a little bit a sophisticated hypothesis in the following way. We hypothesized that in particular the inequality averse should respond. Why? Because they care most about the inequality, so they should respond. But what we also know is that if you are poor or are low income individual, then you have a selfish reason to be in favor of redistribution. So the inequality averse does not differ in his political views from the selfish when they have low income, because they have both a selfish reason to be in favor of redistribution. But when you look at the richer people who have to pay for redistribution, then you have a divide. The selfish rich are against redistribution, but the inequality averse rich, they are in favor of redistribution. So our hypothesis was that it's in particular the inequality averse rich, or let's say affluent, rich means more than the median income. The inequality averse affluent people respond to this information the most. That is the hypothesis, okay? And we can look at this in the data. Here you see the data. This is the graph for the inequality averse. And what you see here, this is support for redistribution. Actually, we have a behavioral measure here. They could donate money to this 99% initiative, and it was indeed given to this initiative. And what you see here is, in the control group, they give much more money than in the treatment group when they have corrected beliefs. So it is indeed the affluent, inequality averse who respond to the truthful and credible information as theory predicts. Okay? Now, when you look at the selfish, well, it goes even in the wrong direction. You know, the control group with the exaggerated beliefs even gives less. So the selfish are pretty random guys here. Not much regularity here. And among the altruists, you see a similar pattern like among the inequality averse, but it doesn't reach statistical significance. So basically, what that tells you is the knowledge about the distribution of preference types helps you also better understand people's response to policies, which is an important piece of information. And with that, I can already summarize. So first, there is rich anthropological evidence that suggests that humans lived under extremely egalitarian conditions for most of their time. This egalitarian ethos can still be observed in individuals' behavior in contemporary small-scale societies and shows up in many experiments with student and non-student subject pools in modern societies. Distributional preferences in representative broad population samples can often be characterized parsimoniously with a type distribution that contains basically just 3 types: inequity averse, altruistic, and selfish. And more generosity in the advantageous domain is strongly correlated with more desire for equality in the disadvantageous domain. Fourth, laboratory measures of distributional preferences have good predictive power for real-world charitable donations and for real-world support for redistribution. Inequality aversion, in particular, but also altruism, appears to play a major role in the political demand for redistribution. Inequality aversion almost nullifies the impact of income on the demand for redistribution, and it is primarily the inequality averse that respond to truthful information about the actual inequality. And finally, and most importantly, Tinbergen was right. Experimental identification of affability curves is possible and yields great scientific benefits. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating lecture. So that leaves some time for questions and discussion. I'll get to you.
Hi, first of all, thank you for that amazing presentation and the incredible insights. I think one of the best insights I thought was purely in a graph. You see the different clusters of people, which you call the selfish type, the altruistic type, and the inequality averse type. Do you have a hunch maybe about why these people are so neatly separated into these discrete clusters rather than just sort of spread out as we see them usually in sort of a cloud, and why someone would belong to a selfish group or an altruistic group or to inequality averse group?
Well, the why question is always the most difficult. I mean, we give people 7 choices, and what surely helps a little bit is the discreteness of the budget line, But that is also an advantage because it forces people to go here or here, Because you have, the problem is, there's also, we know from a lot of evidence, and neuroscience tells us, there's a lot of randomness in people's behavior. And this is, after all, the reason why we use random utility models, where we just put an epsilon on our, as an appendix on our model, and we don't really know where the epsilon comes from, but just to account for this randomness. And I think maybe I take out a little bit of randomness also through the discretization. And, it may not always be that beautiful as it was here, but I'm pretty sure that qualitatively we find this. I mean, there is another task. It's called the equality equivalence test That equality equivalence test has been developed by an economist at the University of Innsbruck, and we have now data from many countries about this equality equivalence test. And when you basically ask the question, the nice thing about this indifference curve approach is that you can say, so you have basically 4 different possibilities. You can have a positively sloped and a negatively sloped in one domain, and you can have a positively sloped and a negatively sloped in the other domain. So you get 4 combinations in a sense. And then you look at how many people fall into these 4 qualitative clusters, just totally descriptively. What you typically see is, I have just recently gotten US data on this, you see a majority of inequality averse, even in the US, interestingly. You see a fairly large group of altruists, and you see a reasonably sized group of selfish people, and then you see a very tiny group of envious people. And that is pretty much what you always see. In Germany, it's even more extreme. The German, that sample that I have, it's the most inequality averse I've ever seen. Which it's too early to say whether this is a German character trait. So this is how it is. I mean, it seems to be the most natural, but it doesn't always, with these other tests, you go just for the signs of the slopes. You don't go for the, now what I have here is even stronger because they go really literally to the middle. And actually, we had to jitter the points to make it visible, otherwise the points would have all stacked up on one single point, which is probably due to the discreteness that we have. If we had had more continuous choices, we would have, that ball that you have seen would have existed without the jitter. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Here's another question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So actually, in the past decade, we have confronted with many crises, such as Great Recession, the refugee crisis in 2016, and also the pandemic now. So people's perceptions are changing. For example, like attitudes towards immigrants and racial minorities deteriorated, and also preferences for redistribution are changing. And we also observe the surge of right-wing or extreme right-wing political sentiments in Europe and in the United States. So I'm wondering, do you think during such crisis, so the assumption in economics such that people or individuals are self-interest or selfish will become more realistic? Or do you think that this kind of assumption will become a trend in the near future? Thanks.
Well, my view is that the self-interest assumption never was true. It was always wrong, but it's only until recently that we have these rigorous tools to measure preferences. Let's say until 1990, we didn't have really good tools to measure in a clean way these preferences. And in particular, the fine-graded way that I described with different costs of the altruistic or envious act. But that doesn't mean that people's preferences change. Actually, I'm a big believer in endogenous preferences. But what is equally important is the fundamental distinction between a selfish behavior and a selfish preference. This is not the same. A selfish preference is a statement about the coefficient, if you like, in a utility model. It tells me, and that selfish, yeah, okay. So for example, in terms of the coefficients, when we estimate an inequality-averse model, we estimate 2 parameters, alpha and beta. And if they are 0, you are selfish, okay? And if they are positive, you are inequality-averse. And I can induce totally selfish behavior among totally inequality-averse people. How do I do this? I make it just incredibly costly to be non-selfish. if you have to sacrifice your life, you probably choose your life over the other person's life. Okay? But, so it's a question, you know, behavior is not the same as a preference. And this is very often a mistake that people make. They make an inference about some behavior and say, oh, the world is a really bad place. They're all bastards. They're all behaving selfishly. No, they're behaving selfishly, but you make this, in psychology, there is the term fundamental attribution error. You infer from an observed behavior something about the personality of that individual, and that's typically problematic because you can't observe from one behavior or even from two behaviors. Well, if you have 20 times observed that your colleague never helps you, you may be probably right that he's a selfish guy. But if you observe it once, maybe his child was ill and he had to run to the hospital. You know, the costs would have been very high in that situation. So there's a difference between behavior and preference. And you can't just infer from behavior in a particular situation what people's preferences are. And when you do it rigorously, you find that most people are not totally selfish. They exist, but the majority is not.
But if you do it rigorously, then do you find that if there's a crisis, that those preferences become more pro-social, or is it more that people turn to self-interest during crisis, or we don't know, perhaps?
I don't know. There is one data set by a group in Berkeley and Ray Fissman and Shahar Khari from Berkeley. They have a paper on the big recession and how it affected social preferences. I forgot what they found.
We look it up.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I have a question on how fixed do you think these preference profiles are? So if I would think that these kinds of experiments are pretty sensitive to the way you frame the distributional problems. So I could think that maybe I turn out inequality averse in one experimental setup and maybe altruistic in another experimental setup, which would mean that it's more difficult to say of a population that you have this sort of fixed distribution between different kinds of people. How do you see this?
Yeah. So there are two answers to that question. One is even if individuals would switch, you could have at the aggregate level stable shares. You know, and that means the stability would occur at the type level. You know, let's say you have roughly, like in Switzerland, 40 to 50% inequality averse, but some people, when I measure their preferences 3 years from now, they might switch to the altruistic and some others might switch to the inequality averse. That will still be useful, that piece of information, you know, because you get some stability at the aggregate level for predictive purposes at the aggregate level. But there is, of course, the legitimate question, how stable is it at the individual level? And we did, we have a study 3 years apart, and we find that roughly 70% are belonging to the same type. They stay where they were, and then there is a little bit of moving around. So we do find that. But I think the other important question is how predictive are these preferences of real-world behavior, you know? And I'm just writing up a review paper on that, and they're pretty predictive. For example, there's a very nice paper in the Journal of Public Economics indicating that people who are more pro-social in the lab experiment, they are much more pro-social during COVID-19. And they have behavioral data, so they are more willing to wear, they were more willing to wear masks, they were more willing to restrain themselves, not to go to the pubs when it was dangerous, and so on. So you do see this cross-correlation quite a bit, yeah.
Thanks for a fascinating talk. I have two questions. The first is something that you already are alluding to, the external validity from the experiments. Yeah. So you identify these three types in your experiments, but there's this saying, when you were young and you weren't left, then you didn't have a heart, And when you're old, you didn't turn right-wing, you didn't have a brain. Could that play a role here, this kind of external validity issues? And my second question, I'm fascinated by these three groups that you identify. Could they be associated with fundamental political values centering around liberty, equality, and sense of community? The French would say égalité, fraternité, et liberté. So would sociology or political science, or maybe even psychology, biology, point to these fundamental, deep-felt wirings that shape people's values to which they think society should be organized?
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, what you see here is it definitely is predictive with regard to their political views on redistribution. Okay, that's what I have shown you. This was this nice graph here. You know, this is the prediction, and this is the support for redistribution. And the inequality verse, they typically support more the left-wing redistributive referenda. That's what we find. So, but there is another dimension here that you were kind of indirectly hinting to, that we don't capture with this measure of social preferences, which is meritocracy. You know, because in our experiment, the money comes from the experimenter, and then I have to distribute. How would I distribute it? And that's not the situation that we typically face, you know. Now, the interesting thing is it's still predictive for the political realm. Now, there is another dimension here, which is, and these experiments have been conducted, in particular by people in Norway, where two people produce a joint output, and then they have to distribute it. And one guy has the choice to distribute it, or the other guy has the choice. How do they do this? And clearly, meritocracy kicks in. The more people very often distribute or redistribute the returns that were produced according to effort or performance. And you might now ask the question, who are the people who do that? Who are the meritocrats? And the interesting thing, we did an experiment where we also had something similar, and we know how they are classified in our paradigm, and we know how they are classified as meritocrats or not in the other paradigm. And what we find is the meritocrats are the altruists and the inequality averse. And the selfish, they don't care about meritocracy. They just take whatever they can grab, you know? And that's a very interesting finding, because it tells you being a meritocrat, that's already a normative notion. You care for a just return. You want to give people their just reward. That's meritocracy, because they worked harder, they put in more effort. You want to reward them. And many people have this ideal. But the interesting thing is, it's the inequality verse in our paradigm and the altruists who are meritocrats. And the selfish are not meritocrats. And that's quite interesting. The selfish are just selfish. You know, don't care for the rest.
So a related question to this, I was wondering when you showed this graph, so these selfish, they can just they take what they want, right? What they can. Is it also the case that the selfish are overrepresented on the right-hand side with high incomes?
No, that's not the case. That's not the case. We have fairly constant distribution of types in these income classes.
Also the altruists, they're also
yes, this
everywhere.
is fairly constant. This is an important argument. Yeah.
Thank you for a fantastic lecture. I was thinking about the outcomes that you have from your administrative data versus the tribal outcomes.
Yeah.
And well, I'm not sure how you exactly measured the tribal outcomes, but could there be also a difference in how people's social preferences are when they're physically interacting versus not physical interactions? And do you have any idea which reveals better their true preferences? And what kind of policy advice could that generate, those insights?
Well, in all these experiments where we measure social preferences, we try to rule out any face-to-face contact. Because that introduces so many confounds: sympathy, antipathy, emotional ties, gender issues. And even when I do an experiment in Papua New Guinea, the people don't know with whom they interact. So this is, you have, when you go to these small-scale societies, you have a very high demand in explaining. These experiments take days, because they come one by one, so into the tent, but they never see their opponent or their partner, never face to face. Because if I do a face-to-face bargaining problem in the ultimatum game, I know what happens. It's always a 50-50 split. Because it's pretty hard to tell the other guy, oh, I take 90 and you get 10. You know, there's a lot of... It's not so easy because the money...
Is that also the case for the selfish type?
What did you say?
The selfish type, do they
Even the
also-
selfish type, they respond to this very strong... You know, there's a reputation at stake. In the face-to-face interaction, a reputation is at stake. And the interesting thing is, nobody wants to be considered selfish, you know? But some people want to be selfish, but don't want to be considered as selfish. These are the clever selfish, you know?
So this is an argument for transparency then, no? It makes us behave pro-socially, right?
In some contexts, making things visible helps, yeah.
Yeah, so about making things visible, thank you so much for your very interesting lecture. With the inequality averse people, when they saw that the income distribution was actually not as, I guess, horrible as they thought it was, they actually chose for less redistribution. That would have quite big policy implications, I guess, in practice. What is your view on that, or how do we deal with this?
Well, I mean, I think one thing is getting the information out in a credible way. The problem you have, I mean, we have an advantage in the experiment. In the experiment, we can frame this in a way that it's really credible. We rely on the statistical office. When you are in the heat of political competition, it's much harder to communicate the truth. And recent events in the last 10 years, look around Brazil, US, it's very hard that the truth gets through. When all things become ambiguous, it's very hard. So now Switzerland is a society, and also the Netherlands. It's a bit different, I think. People have much more trust in political institutions, and I think it's very important to maintain that trust. And when there is this trust, then the statistical office, if it's non-partisan, you need non-partisan institutions that have high trust in a society, that can communicate things like that. And it's of high value to generate such non-partisan institutions, impartial institutions. That's probably not totally satisfactory, but at least a little bit in the direction I think one should go.
So there's time for one more question.
Thank you. I was triggered by the last thing you said about trust. And I wondered, because in the Netherlands we have, of course, a very elaborate welfare system, but it's also probably quite strict, and some people would maybe even call some aspects oppressive. And I wonder what it says about Dutch preferences. So at first I was thinking, looking at your lines, that maybe you could think that this means we're almost envious, because we're willing to take on large costs for society to make sure that someone doesn't benefit too much, right? But then I also thought maybe it's more that we have a very a strong feeling for equality, and that we're willing to take on very high costs for society to make sure no one abuses our equality. And I just wonder, what your thoughts could be about this.
Well, I believe that the notion of meritocracy plays here a big role when it comes to the welfare state. So what most people really hate is when they have the feeling that people who could work and contribute to society exploit the welfare state. And that's almost universal, I believe. I mean, when I do, for example, in a laboratory, it's a public good, basically. A social insurance system is kind of a public good because you insure people against adverse events, and everybody can benefit in principle, but there may be some free riders who exploit that. And when we run experiments with free riding opportunities, and in one of these experiments, what we did is we had scenarios at the end of the experiment where we asked the individuals about their emotions towards other individuals in the group. And these emotions could be all kinds of things, and one of the emotions was anger. And these were just university students, you might think cool-headed and so on. But when you give them a scale from 1 to 7, and typically people don't go to the extremes. They go to 3, 4, 5. That's already extreme 5. But when it comes to anger against the free riders, the whole group is at 6 and 7. So there's such a strong emotion. There's an undercurrent here that is kind of burned into people's emotional system. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that evolutionarily we face lots of public goods problems as societies, even hunter-gatherers. When they go hunting jointly, when they defend themselves against other tribes, there's always the tendency, so I let the others fight and I go, I don't fight. And so they developed very strong instincts against free riding. And you can play with these instincts also in a populist way, of course. You can, and this is the danger, so to speak. There are these instincts here, and you can basically play with them and make it look, there may be some family, we had these cases in Austria where one family gets child allowances for 5 children, and maybe they don't even exist, and they live all in Turkey, and these stories, and they've blown up in the newspapers, and people get angry at this, and it's maybe it's even true, but it's one family, and then it's blown up as if it's the representative thing. So there is a lot of, there is an evolutionary foundation for this that has to do with aversion against free riders. People have a very deep aversion against free riders. And that can be used for the good, and it can be exploited for the bad.
Okay, thank you very much once more. Yeah, and of course we also have a little present for you, and it's a rather special present. It's what we give each and every year to the economist who delivers the Tinbergen lecture. It's a Mackemer plate. It has your name on it and the date, and that it's a Tinbergen lecture. And actually, this is the second Mackemer plate with your name on it that was manufactured, because the first one was wrongly addressed to the Dutch Central Bank in Amsterdam. So they thought that the Dutch Economist Day would take place there this year, and so then it got traveling around throughout Amsterdam and got broken at some point. And so at the very last minute they had to make a new one, but we checked it. It's actually like the original, and so we're very pleased to give it to you, and we hope that you like it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And then in the last 30 seconds, let me do a little bit of promotion. There are 2 events coming up this month of KVS. So in less than 2 weeks, we have the pre-advies event. It's at the Ministry of Economic Affairs. And pre-advies this year are about corporate governance and social responsibility. It's a highly topical issue and a very interesting collection of articles, I can tell you. So you are warmly welcome to attend the event. Registration is still possible. And then in 3.5 weeks' time, we have the event in Rotterdam. And that event will be about wealth inequality. We discussed this already this morning in one of the sessions of this event today. Feels like a warming up, and so then in 3 weeks' time we have more discussion on that very same topic in Arminius, and you're also all warmly welcome there. You can get your free ticket with a promo code that we sent you earlier by email. So we look forward to see you there, and of course later on this afternoon at Dutch Economist Day. Have a great afternoon, and also see you at the drinks.